There are things a person does without thinking. Elara Voss did not think when she heard the sound in the rain. She had been crossing the back field behind her cottage, lantern swinging low through the dark, when something between the old oak roots moved. Not the wind, not an animal. Something bigger. Something breathing wrong. She went toward it anyway. He was in human form, which surprised her later when she had time to be surprised. She had heard stories about the wolves, that they patrolled the border forests in their shifted shapes, massive and silver-eyed, and nothing like the monsters the old ballads described. But this one had been caught in human skin when whatever had found him in the dark did its damage. 3 deep gashes across his ribs, a 4th along his shoulder. He was shaking so hard the dead leaves around him trembled. She did not know his name. She did not ask it. She dragged him inside before she could talk herself out of it, packed the wounds with her mother's herbs, and stayed awake through the whole first night pressing cloths to his side, while the rain hammered the cottage roof. He was delirious for 2 days. When the fever finally broke, he opened his eyes and looked at her with the most peculiar expression she had ever seen. Not gratitude. Not suspicion. Something steadier than both. Something that looked like recognition, though she had never seen him before in her life. She read to him while he healed, because the silence made her restless. He listened without interrupting, which was unusual enough to be remarkable. On the 4th night he said, quietly, "You read like you wrote it yourself." She had laughed and told him her father had been a scribe, that the words were his, passed down, that she had memorized most of his library before she was 12. He did not smile often, but he smiled then. On the 5th morning she woke to an empty cot and a single silver coin on the pillow where his head had been. No name, no explanation. She kept the coin. She told herself she forgot about him. She did not forget about him. 3 years later, Elara arrived at Ironwood Capital with ink-stained fingers, a satchel full of treaty drafts, and absolutely no idea what she was walking into. The summons had come through official channels, a rolled parchment sealed in dark wax and delivered by a wolf courier who had not smiled or spoken beyond the bare minimum. The Human Council had appointed her as the treaty scribe for the historic peace agreement between the human settlements and the Ironwood Pack. Her father had written 3 such agreements in his lifetime. She had assisted on 1, 2 years before his death. The work she understood. She was good at it. It was everything else she was uncertain about. Ironwood Capital sat at the center of the forest territories, built from the same ancient dark wood as its name, rising in towers that tapered into the tree line rather than cutting above it. The architecture was unlike anything in the human settlements, organic, deliberate, like something that had grown rather than been constructed. Elara tilted her head back, looking up at it, and nearly walked into a guard. Lady Voss. The guard steadied her without comment, impressively diplomatic. The general will receive you. Not the king, the Hinidal. She filed that away. She was shown through corridors she immediately began memorizing, left at the Iron Stag, right at the carved moon, straight through the arch of antlers, and brought to a receiving hall that was warm and firelit and considerably less formal than she had anticipated. The man waiting inside was standing with his back to her when she entered, looking out a window at the training yard below. He turned when the guard announced her, and Elara had just enough time to form an impression. Tall, broad-shouldered, hair the color of dark honey, jaw that looked like it had been decided upon carefully, before he smiled, and the formality of the room somehow evaporated entirely. Lady Voss. His voice was warm and unhurried. I'm Davin Ashvane. I apologize for the formal title. My soldiers get nervous when I tell them to drop it. Elara blinked. You're the general? Surprised? He seemed genuinely curious, not offended. You seem very relaxed for someone who commands an army. Davin laughed. It was an uncomplicated sound, easy and bright. That's the most diplomatic version of that observation I've ever heard, and you're not even officially working yet. He gestured to the chairs arranged near the fire. Sit. You've been in a carriage for 2 days, and you look like you need something warm before we discuss anything complicated. Elara sat. A servant appeared with tea before she had fully settled, which spoke to either excellent training or someone who had been watching for her arrival. "The treaty negotiations begin in 3 days," Davin said, folding himself into the opposite chair with the ease of someone who had never been uncomfortable in his life. "That gives you time to settle, review the existing draft, ask whatever questions you need. We've given you full access to the archive." He paused. "My brother insisted on that." "Your brother is the king?" Elara asked. Something crossed Davin's face briefly. Not quite a shadow, but a complexity. "He is," he said. "King Kale. You'll meet him at the formal opening of negotiations." "Not before?" Davin searched for the word. "He prefers formal contexts for formal matters," which told her almost nothing. Elara wrapped her hands around her cup and decided to take it as information anyway. Reserved then, or cautious, or both. "Walk me through the existing draft," she said, shifting into the work that she knew. "I want to understand where the disagreements are before I start writing." Davin's expression shifted, still warm but newly attentive. He leaned forward. "You get right to it, don't you?" "You said 3 days," Elara said simply. "I don't like to waste them." He looked at her for a moment with something she could not quite name in his amber eyes. Then he called for the documents. She had not expected to like Davin Ashvane. This was not a calculated thing. She had arrived without strong opinions about anyone. But over the 3 days before negotiations formally opened, he was simply everywhere, appearing at the archive with a suggestion about a clause she had been struggling with, materializing in the courtyard when she took her morning walk because, he claimed, he ran that path at the same hour every day, bringing her a particular kind of ironwood tea on the second afternoon after she had mentioned, once, that she found the standard blend too bitter. He was relentlessly, disarmingly good company. He asked questions about her work with what seemed like genuine interest, not politeness. He told her stories about the pack's history with the self-deprecating humor of someone who had memorized every detail and found most of it both important and absurd. He was not like the formal, careful image she had built of wolf aristocracy in her head. He was also, she gradually noticed, not subtle at all. "You have the most precise handwriting I have ever seen," he said on the second day, leaning over her shoulder to look at a draft clause. He was close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating off him. "Like every letter is a decision." "My father insisted on it," Elara said, keeping her eyes on the page. "He said careless handwriting led to careless thinking." "Smart man." Davin didn't move away. "What was he like?" "Exacting," she said. "Fair. He loved language the way some people love people, like it was alive and worth being careful with. And you inherited that." "I inherited his library and his terrible sleeping hours," Elara said dryly. "The rest I had to work for." Davin smiled at the side of her face. She did not look up, but she was aware of it with a precision that she found mildly inconvenient. On the 3rd day, 2 things happened in close succession. First, a noblewoman named Lady Cress materialized beside Elara in the main corridor, and said, with the bright fixed smile of someone delivering a warning through their teeth, "You must be the treaty scribe. How lovely. We've all been so curious about the human girl the general has been spending all his time with." Elara looked at her steadily. "Mostly we've been discussing contract law," she said. "It's a specific kind of thrill." Lady Cress's smile remained perfect and did not reach her eyes. "Of course," she said. "Second, and more significant, was that later the same afternoon, Davin sat across from her in the archive, while she was reading through a border clause that made no legal sense, and said without any particular preamble, "I think I'd like to see more of you after the treaty is finished." Elara looked up. He was watching her with that amber steadiness, hands loose on the table. He had not, she noticed, dressed it up in formality or pretense. He had simply said it. "What does more of me look like?" she asked carefully. "I'm not sure yet," Davin said honestly, "but I think it starts with you not leaving the moment the ink dries." Elara considered him. Considered the whole warm reality of him, the ease, the lack of pretense, the way he had made a strange court feel almost navigable. She thought about the silver coin she still carried in her satchel, an old irrational habit, and told herself that was a different thing entirely. "I'll think about it," she said. Davin nodded, like that was a perfectly good answer. "I can work with that," he said. The formal opening of the treaty negotiations was held in the Great Hall. Elara had dressed carefully, deep blue, her best, ink-free, and arrived early to arrange her materials at the scribing table, set to the left of the main negotiating chairs. She was used to being the person in the corner of important rooms, the one whose function everyone needed and whose presence most people forgot. She preferred it that way. It made observation easier. She was examining the wax seal on the existing draft when the hall began to fill. She did not look up immediately when the room's energy shifted. She registered it, that particular change in the quality of attention, the way conversation lowered. But she was holding a page at an angle to catch the light, checking for a smear in the third clause. Then someone to her left drew a sharp breath. She looked up. He stood at the far end of the hall, at the head of the assembly, flanked by advisors and guards, and the entire gravitational pull of a room that had rearranged itself to face him. He wore dark formal robes, a silver chain of office across his chest, his dark hair pushed back from a face that was all clean angles and carefully held stillness. Elara's hand went flat on the table. She knew that face. Not the formality of it, not the crown's weight or the assembly's deference. Underneath all of it, stripped of ceremony and rank and everything that came with them, she knew the architecture of that jaw. She knew the precise way those silver eyes moved across a room before settling. She had watched those eyes for 5 days, holding a lamp close while she checked a wound's progress, reading aloud while a fever worked itself out. She had last seen that face by lantern light, on a pillow that subsequently held a silver coin. King Kale of the Ironwood Pack was the stranger she had dragged in from the rain. She sat perfectly still while the room settled around her, while the opening formalities began, while his gaze swept the hall and crossed the scribing table and passed over her without pause. Without pause. She had expected something. Recognition. Surprise. Even discomfort. Instead she got nothing, a gaze that moved past her like she was part of the furniture, present and functional and entirely unremarkable. Something cold settled in her chest. She picked up her pen. She wrote the date at the top of the fresh page. She did her job because the treaty was real and her purpose here was real. And she was not the sort of person who fell apart during formal proceedings. But her handwriting, precise as always, took 3 lines to stop carrying the slight tremor she could feel in her fingers and was determined not to let anyone see. She did not sleep well. By the 4th day of negotiations, Elara had established a routine that kept her occupied enough not to think too much about the man at the head of the table, who had not looked at her directly once. She reviewed the clauses. She drafted language. She caught an error in the border provision on the second afternoon that the Human Council's ambassador called exceptional attention to detail and that Elara called basic reading. Davin found her in the archive that evening, looking like someone who was working too hard to avoid thinking. "You've been very quiet," he said, dropping into the chair across from her. "I'm always quiet," Elara said. "You're quieter than you're quiet," he said. Something happened in the opening session. Elara did not look up from the clause she was annotating. Negotiation is tiring. "Elara," she looked up. He was watching her with that amber frankness. No performance to it, no angles. She had come to recognize it as simply the way he was made. "I recognize someone," she said carefully. "Someone I met a few years ago." Davin's expression shifted into something more careful. "Kale," he said. It was not a question. Her pen stilled. "He was in your territory," Davin said. 3 years ago, he went out alone against every protocol in the history of this pack and came back 5 days later with healed wounds and wouldn't explain where he'd been. His voice was even, almost academic, but his eyes were watching her very closely. "I've always wondered." Elara set down the pen. "He didn't tell you?" "He told me he found help. He didn't say from whom." Davin paused. He's not easy to explain, my brother. He carries everything inward, has since we were children. Elara was quiet for a moment, arranging what she felt into something she could examine. He looked through me, she said finally. In the opening session, like I wasn't there. Something moved across Davin's face that she could not name. He does that, Davin said. When something matters too much. She did not know what to do with that. She picked up her pen again. Davin let the silence sit for a moment. Then, quietly, he said, I meant what I said the other day, about wanting more time with you. Elara looked at him. And I know, he continued, that my brother is somewhere in whatever you're thinking about right now. He was not resentful, just precise. I'm not asking you to stop thinking about it. I'm just asking you not to make any decisions from that cold place he put you in. He reached across the table and touched her hand, brief and careful. You deserve better than being looked through. Elara's chest tightened. She thought about silver eyes that had tracked her every movement for 5 days and had passed over her today like she was nothing. She thought about Davin, who had spent 3 days learning how she took her tea. All right, she said quietly. Ask me again in a week. Davin nodded. A week, he agreed. But it was not a week. It was 3 days, and it happened not in the archive but in the great hall, in front of the full assembly. The third round of negotiations had stalled on a water rights clause that the human ambassador and the Pack Council's head advisor, a rigid man named Aldrich, had been circling for an hour without resolution. Elara had flagged the issue twice in her notes but had not spoken. It was not the scribe's role to enter the negotiation, only to document it. Then Devon leaned forward and said, Lady Voss, you've been looking at this clause since yesterday. What do you see? Elara looked up. Everyone in the room looked at her. She felt the familiar calculation of that moment. Say nothing, remain a scribe, stay invisible. Or say what was true and useful. She chose what was true. She laid out the issue in 4 sentences. The hall was quiet when she finished. Aldrich said crisply, That is a perceptive observation for a human with no territorial stake in this agreement. Elara looked at him. I have a stake in it being accurate, she said. That's what I was hired for. There was a small, sharp silence. And then Davin stood up. He did not announce anything. He was not that formal. He simply stood, and the weight of the room shifted toward him the way it did when he chose to claim space. He looked at Elara with an expression that was open and decided and entirely without self-consciousness.
I intend to formally request Lady Voss as my chosen mate.
To the court,
he said,
to my king, and
to the court,
her. To my king, and to her. He looked at Elara directly. That last one being the only one that actually matters. The room erupted. Elara sat very still in the sudden chaos of whispered voices, and was aware of precisely one thing. The man at the head of the table who had not looked at her in 3 days, had gone absolutely rigid. She made herself not look at him. She looked at Davin instead, who was watching her with those steady amber eyes and no apology for any of it. Cale called her to his study that evening. She almost did not go. She sat in her chamber for 20 minutes after the guard delivered the summons, and looked at her own hands, and thought about several things she could say, and several more she should probably not. Then she went. His study was smaller than she expected, shelved floor to ceiling with books and treaty documents, and maps marked in faded ink. A fire burned low in the grate. He was standing when she entered, not at the desk but at the window, looking out at the dark. He did not turn when she came in. Lady Voss, he said. Your Majesty, she said, because it was the correct form and she was very determined to observe every correct form within his territory. He turned then. He looked at her, directly fully, for the first time since the opening session, and the thing she saw in his face was not what she had prepared herself for. She had armored herself against coldness, against the nothing he had shown her for 3 days. He looked tired, deeply, specifically tired, in the way of someone who had been carrying something heavy for much longer than was reasonable. My brother has announced an intention, Cale said. Protocol requires I either endorse or refuse it before it becomes binding. I have 3 days to decide. I'm aware, Elara said carefully. Are you? Something shifted in his voice. Not heat exactly, but something adjacent. Did you come here knowing who I was? The question surprised her with its directness. No, she said. I recognized you in the opening session. A long beat of silence. You should have said something, he said. Something bright and hot moved through Elara's chest. Should I? She said, and she heard the edge in her own voice and did not bother to smooth it. You looked through me like I had never existed. What exactly should I have said? His jaw tightened. He began, stopped, started again. It was complicated. You left a coin, Elara said. Her voice came out flatter than she intended. After 5 days, I didn't even know your name. Cale was quiet for a long moment. In the firelight his face was all shadow and angle, unreadable in the way she had forgotten about. The particular reserve that was specific to him and no one else. Then, I couldn't tell you who I was. You couldn't leave a name either, apparently. Elara. Her name in his mouth was different from anyone else's, and the familiarity of it after all this time was startling enough that she flinched slightly. He noticed. If I had told you my name, you would have found me. You're the kind of person who finds things. That's not a reason, she said. That's an excuse. It's both, he said quietly. I knew what finding me would have meant. I knew what this place was. He looked around the study, the walls, the weight of the books, the treaty documents, the life that surrounded him like a structure he had not chosen, but had been built inside of. I didn't want you to find it. Elara stared at him. You hid from me, she said, not angry now. Something more complicated than that. For 3 years. Yes, he said simply. And now your brother has claimed me. His expression did not change exactly, but something behind his eyes shifted like water under ice. Yes, he said again, more quietly. And you called me here to tell me, what? She asked. That you endorse it? That you refuse it? What is the point of this conversation, Cale? The name landed between them. His name in her mouth after 3 years of not knowing it was as strange and weighted as hers and his. I don't know, he said. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she walked to the door. She paused with her hand on the frame. Your brother, she said, without turning around, has looked at me every day like I matter. Whatever else is complicated, that is not. She left, she thought, in the days that followed, that she had made her position clear to herself. That the calculation was simple. She was wrong. Clarity, it turned out, and simplicity were not the same thing. Davin was good to her. He was easy and warm, and he made her laugh. And she did not take that lightly because she had spent 3 years in a house with her father's books, and the peculiar loneliness of someone whose work was their primary companion. Davin treated her like a person and not a function, and she had not expected that from a wolf general in a foreign court. But Cale was a problem she could not resolve. He was everywhere she looked, not because he sought her out, but because he was the center of the place she was in, and she was gravitationally incapable of not registering where he was. She knew when he entered rooms before she could see him, some particular shift in the air, in the attention of everyone present, a prickling awareness at the back of her neck that she resented, and could not switch off. He had not called her back to the study. He had not, since that evening, looked through her either. He looked at her now, when they were in the same space, with an expression she could not categorize. Not longing exactly. Not regret. Something more interior than either, something being held very deliberately in check. She watched him conduct negotiations with a precision that was almost painful to observe. He listened to everyone. He asked the right questions. He had read her treaty drafts, she realized on the 4th day. Had read them carefully, because he referenced specific word choices in discussion with a particularity that only came from actual reading, not summary. He said nothing about it. He said nothing about her. He was profoundly, committedly silent on the subject of Elara Voss. And then there was the night of the packed dinner. It was a formal event, all the court, the visiting human delegation, the treaty parties assembled in the banquet hall. Elara sat in the middle of a long table between a council member's wife, who asked polite questions about her hometown, and an older wolf advisor who did not speak to her at all. She was making quiet work of the meal when she became aware of Lady Cress, positioned 3 seats down, leaning toward another woman, and speaking in a voice calibrated to carry just far enough. "The general is sentimental," Lady Cress was saying. "He's always been. He'll tire of her once the novelty wears off. A human scribe as the general's mate." A small, dismissive sound. "She doesn't even know how to conduct herself at table. Did you see her at the opening reception?" Elara set down her fork, placed her hands flat on the table, breathed out slowly. "The council won't allow it to go forward," another voice agreed. "Aldrich is already preparing a formal objection. The king will refuse." "Of course he will," Lady Cress said. "He has more sense than his brother." Elara looked up. Cale was watching her from the head of the table, not with a nothing from the opening session, not with a contained interior look from the corridors. He was watching her with the full force of his attention, direct and unguarded for the first time, and she realized with a small shock that he had heard every word Lady Cress had said and was waiting to see what Elara would do. She looked back at him steadily. She did not perform composure. She simply had it, because she had learned it from a father who had sat in rooms where he was underestimated his entire career and had chosen, always, to let the work answer. After a long moment, Cale looked at Lady Cress. "The Lady Voss," he said, cutting cleanly through the ambient noise of the table, "caught an error in the border provision on the second day of negotiations that would have compromised the eastern water rights of 40 villages in the human settlements and invalidated the corresponding pack guarantees." His voice was conversational, precise. She caught it in under 20 minutes of reviewing a draft our legal counsel had approved. He looked back at Elara. "Your father trained you well," he said. Dead silence at the table. Elara's heart was beating somewhere it should not have been. "Thank you, Your Majesty," she said, "because those were the right words in the right order." He nodded, looked away. The dinner continued. Davin, seated further down the table, had watched all of it. When their eyes met, he raised his cup slightly. She could not tell what was in his expression. Something layered and knowing and, underneath everything else, a little bit sad. She found Cale in the treaty archive at midnight. She had gone for the same reason she always went late to archives. Too many thoughts, not enough to do with them, the need for work to hold on to. She had not expected anyone else to be there. She certainly had not expected him, sitting at the central table with 3 treaty documents open and a cup of cold tea at his elbow, looking like a man who had also come here to think, and was now doing a poor job of it. He looked up when she came in. Neither of them spoke. Elara crossed to the opposite side of the table, pulled out a chair and sat down with the claws she had been working on. She opened her satchel. She arranged her materials. She could feel him watching. "You don't have to stay," she said, to the page. "Neither do you," he said. A small, absurd silence. "Did you mean it?" she asked, still not looking up. "What you said at dinner?" "I meant every word I have ever said to you," Cale said. "That's part of the problem." She did look up then. He was watching her with that particular expression she had catalogued during 5 days of his fever. The one that meant he was deciding something, weighing it, not ready to let it out yet. She had not seen it since she arrived. She had not expected to see it again. "What's the rest of the problem?" she asked. "Elara." His voice was quiet and careful. "My brother has claimed you." "He has," she agreed. "And you've said nothing." "I have no right to say anything," Cale said. "I am the reason he had the opportunity, because you disappeared." "Because I left," he said. The distinction seemed to matter to him. "I left deliberately, because staying would have meant asking something of you that you hadn't agreed to and wouldn't have understood until you were already here, already inside all of this." He spread one hand slightly, indicating the archive, the court, the whole structure of the life he lived inside. "I didn't want to be the reason you were trapped somewhere that made you miserable." Elara's pen was still in her hand. She was not writing. "And if I had chosen it," she said, "if you had told me who you were and I had chosen to come anyway, would you have?" he asked simply. She opened her mouth, closed it. The answer was complicated in a way she had not looked directly at. She did not know what she would have done, 3 years ago, summoned to a Wolf King's court with full knowledge of what she was walking into. She was not the same person she had been then. She was not sure the person she had been then would have been brave enough. "You took the choice from me," she said finally. "Yes," he said. "I know, I was wrong." The admission was so clean it caught her off guard. No justification after it, no qualifier. Just, "I was wrong." She looked at him across the table and thought about 5 days of lantern light, and a man with fever-bright eyes who had listened to her read and said, once, "Your voice makes the words sound like they matter." She had not thought of it in years. She thought of it now with the vividness of something she had been carrying without knowing it. "There's a silver coin," she said. "I still have it." Something moved across his face. "I didn't have anything else," he said. "I couldn't give you my name. I couldn't give you an explanation. I had nothing to leave you with that was honest." His voice was rougher now, the careful control fraying slightly at the edges. "Except something I valued. So you would know that whatever else you thought about me when you woke up and found me gone, it wasn't because you didn't matter." Elara's chest was doing something painful and insistent that she was attempting to manage with mixed results. "You infuriating man," she said, and her voice came out barely above a whisper. "I know," he said. "Your brother is good," she said. "He's genuinely good. And he looked at me from the beginning like I was worth looking at, and that is not a small thing, Cale." "I know that too," Cale said. His jaw was set, his hands flat on the table. "I know what Davin is, I know what he's offered you, and I have no argument against any of it except—" He stopped. "Except what?" she said. He stood. He came around the table slowly, giving her every opportunity to stop him, to say no, to put up a hand. She didn't. He stopped 2 feet from her and looked down at her with those silver eyes that had watched her across a fever, and across 3 years, and across a banquet table, and said, "Except that it was your voice I heard every night for 3 years when I couldn't sleep. Except that I have read every treaty clause you've written, and heard your father's teaching in every single word choice, and wanted to tell you that every single time. Except that when I found out you were coming here, when I saw your name on the appointment papers," his voice broke, clean and sharp, and he stopped, jaw working. "I should have come to you immediately. Instead I looked through you in that opening session because I could not—" Another stop. "Because if I had looked at you in front of everyone I would not have been able to stop." Elara stood up. She was not thinking. She had told herself she was going to think. She was not thinking. She put her hand flat against his chest, over the wolf-sharp beat of his heart, and felt him go completely still. "You are so much trouble," she said. "Yes," he agreed, his voice barely there. She kissed him. He kissed her back with the 3-year accumulated weight of someone who had been holding a door shut for a very long time. His hands came up to frame her face, careful and deliberate, like she was something he was not going to handle carelessly again. She felt the shift in him, the release of something that had been wound very tight for a very long time, and leaned into it. When they finally broke apart, they stood with their foreheads together in the midnight archive and did not speak for a moment. "Davin," Elara said finally. "I know," Cale said. "He deserves honesty," she said. "He does," Cale agreed. "And he's going to be insufferable about being right." Elara pulled back slightly. "Right about what?" Something crossed Cale's face that might, from a certain angle, have been the ghost of that rare smile she remembered. "He told me, when your name came through on the appointment papers, he said, that if I didn't speak to you first, he was going to." A pause. "I told him to stay out of it." Elara stared at him. "Davin's announcement," she said slowly. "In the Great Hall, he did that on purpose." Cale looked at her steadily. "My brother has been watching me carry something I wouldn't put down for 3 years, he said. He has very little patience for self-imposed suffering." Elara thought about Davin's amber eyes and the layered, knowing expression at the dinner table. She thought about his hand on hers in the archive, brief and careful. "You deserve better than being looked through." "He knew," she said. "He knew the whole time. He has always known me better than I've known myself," Cale said. "It's tremendously annoying." She spoke to Davin the next morning, in the same archive, in the same early light. She did not rehearse it. She had found, over the years, that rehearsed honesty sounded like a performance. She sat across from him and told him the truth in the simplest language she had, that she had feelings for Cale that she had been carrying without knowing it, that Davin had been real and good and important to her, and that she was sorry. Davin listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then, how long did it take him to actually say anything? He asked. Elara blinked. "Midnight," she said. "In this room." "Midnight," Davin exhaled. "I honestly expected it to take longer." He looked at the table for a moment, his hands loose in front of him. "Are you happy?" he asked, and there was nothing complicated in the question. It was simply a question. "I think I might be able to be," Elara said. "For the first time in a while." Davin nodded slowly. Something moved across his face. Real grief, she thought, the kind that didn't pretend to be otherwise, and then it settled into something more resolved. He looked up. "He carried you for 3 years," Davin said, without saying a word about it, without giving himself any relief. That's an entirely specific kind of suffering, and it's also entirely him. A pause. "For what it's worth, I did genuinely want you for myself. That wasn't strategy." "I know," Elara said. "That's what made it difficult." He nodded again. Then, after a moment, "He's going to need someone who can tell him when he's being an idiot," he said. "He doesn't hear it from me because he thinks I'm biased." "He probably won't hear it from me either," Elara said. Davin smiled. "Real, if thin." "Maybe, but at least you can tell him from the inside." He pushed back from the table. "The water rights clause still has a problem in the second sub-provision," he said, shifting completely, the soldier in him resettling over everything else. "I noticed it this morning." Elara felt something loosen in her chest. "Show me," she said. He showed her. The treaty negotiations concluded 8 days later, and Elara Voss sat at the scribing table and read back the final agreed language in a clear voice, every word her father had taught her to value, every clause she had written or sharpened or salvaged. The hall was very quiet when she finished. Aldrich signed first, with the stiffness of a man who had lost several arguments he had expected to win. The human ambassador signed second, beaming. Davin signed for the Pax military guarantee, his hand steady. Then Cale signed, and he looked at her when he did it. Just at her, for a long specific moment, while the witnesses waited, and the hall held its breath, and the pen was still in his hand. She looked back. She had come here as the scribe. She had come to document something that mattered. That had not changed. But she was no longer the same woman who had arrived with ink-stained fingers and an old silver coin in her satchel, telling herself she had forgotten the man she had dragged in from the rain. She had not forgotten him. She had been carrying him the same way he had been carrying her, without either of them knowing the other was doing the same thing. He signed. The treaty was complete. 6 months after the signing, Elara Voss moved permanently to Ironwood Capital. Not as a scribe, though she continued to do the work she loved. There were always treaties, always documents, always language that needed someone to care about it enough to get it right. But as herself, as the woman who had pulled a wounded wolf king out of the rain and spent 5 days arguing with his fever and then missed him for 3 years without knowing she was doing it, she negotiated her own terms, as was her nature. She would keep her workroom. She would not be managed by Aldrich, who had not entirely forgiven her for the water rights clause. She reserved the right to tell Cale when he was being difficult, which he was regularly. He agreed to all of it with the gravity of a man ratifying something important. She kept the silver coin on her work table. He saw it there once and did not comment on it, but she caught the expression on his face. The one she had catalogued over 5 days of fever, the one that meant something was being decided or accepted or finally set down. And she understood it. Some things you carry for a long time. Not because you choose to, but because they belong to you and you belong to them, and the moment you recognize that, the weight of them changes. It becomes less like a burden and more like ballast, like the thing that keeps you level. Davin came to visit regularly, which he would have done regardless. He brought wine and strong opinions and the specific kind of irreverence that only a twin could deploy. And he made Kale laugh in a way that Elara suspected had been rarer before she arrived. He was good to her in the way she had always known he would be. Direct and warm and without resentment, which said everything about who he was. She grew to understand Ironwood the way she understood good language, slowly, precisely, on her own terms. The court adjusted to her because it had no choice. Aldrich remained rigid. Lady Cress became marginally less openly hostile after Elara correctly identified a false clause in a neighboring Pax Treaty submission that saved Ironwood considerable territory, which she mentioned to no one and allowed to settle as its own answer. At night, in the room that was hers and also his, Kale would sometimes wake from whatever dark thing lived in the territory of kings, and she would read to him, as she had done in a lantern-lit cottage a long time ago, until the weight of sleep came back. He never asked her to. She simply did it, because it was the thing she knew how to give, and because his breathing changed within minutes, and because she had always known that words, treated carefully, could hold someone. He told her once, quietly, that he had thought about her voice every night for 3 years. She told him that was an extremely inefficient way to handle the situation. He said, "I know." She said, "Don't do it again." He said he wouldn't, and he meant it with the entirety of who he was, which she had learned to recognize. And somewhere in the south of the territory, in a general's quarters that were warmer than they should have been for a military building, and had too many books in them to be entirely orthodox, Davin Ashvane read reports about border stability and a peace agreement holding steadier than any before it, and thought that some things, if you loved them right, you had to be willing to let go. He was getting better at that. The work helped, and the wine. If you made it this far, thank you. There is something about people who find each other across wrong timing and bad choices, and too much silence that I cannot stop thinking about. Tell me in the comments. Do you believe people can carry someone without knowing it? I think they can. I think sometimes the heart keeps receipts the mind has no record of. See you in the next one.